the next 4 weeks, we're going to be talking about Neoplatonism, and today is the introductory lesson about Neoplatonism and its legacy. So my goals for this entire course is that I am hoping that by the end, you will have a general understanding about the philosophy and the practices associated with Neoplatonism, and that you'll be able to see the connection between the ancient Neoplatonic tradition and the development of various forms of Western esotericism. So I'm hoping that you will be able to see some of the connections between these things, because the Neoplatonic material is source material for many of the traditions that come later. And I'm also really hoping that if you decide that you want to attempt to read some of these texts yourself, that hopefully you'll be inspired to do so, and that you'll have a foundation of understanding that will allow you to approach these texts, especially those of the three, what I consider the most important Neoplatonic philosophers, with a better hope of understanding and getting more out of it, because then you'll have that kind of background. So I'm hoping you'll be inspired to take a look at some of these texts. And as I said, that you'll have enough background knowledge that it will make it easier for you to get through and understand them. So Neoplatonism, as we mean it here, it does have a very specific kind of meaning. It is a Platonic tradition. So it's in the tradition of Plato, that is founded by Plotinus. Plotinus is generally reckoned to be the first Neoplatonist, and his dates are 204 or 5 to 270 CE. And Neoplatonism is a synthesis of Platonic, Aristotelian, and Stoic thought mixed with a very heavy dose of mysticism. So there are a number of key concepts that I will be elaborating on later, both in this lecture and then also as we see them play out in the three next major philosophers that we're going to cover. But generally, the key concepts in Neoplatonism is that it is a monistic tradition. So it is a tradition in which there is ultimate unity that then is both the source of all of the manifest, and in a way, all of the manifest is participating in that unity. So it is that kind of tradition that is all about ultimately unity. And from this unity then, through the process of emanation, which we will spend more time on in a bit, through emanation, the manifold reality comes from this unity into multiplicity. And so it is what we call an ontological cosmology. Ontology is the form of philosophy that has to do with beingness, and then cosmology is about the creation of the world. And so in this type of system, which I believe is common in pretty much every esoteric system that I know in the West, that the descent into the mantles of density, if you want to call it that, it's all beings. Everything is being all the way down, and everything has consciousness. It also, therefore, involves what we sometimes call celestial hierarchies as part of this emanation, because when you have the emanation, there is a natural hierarchy that is being progressed from the source to the next level, and from that level into the next, where that becomes the source. So it is a hierarchical system that also is then connected to divine beings in which we participate. There is no such thing as absolute evil in Neoplatonism. There is only relative evil. There is only a lack or a distortion of good. Evil itself does not have an essential nature in this kind of system. This system also, in all the Neoplatonic schools, does embrace reincarnation. And again, that is something that is very common. It's not just in the Eastern esoteric, it is also in the Western esoteric, and it is very explicit in Neoplatonism. And the cosmology, as we are in this process of coming down from unity into the manifold manifestation, also includes then within it the process of reascent, which is what we would call spiritual evolution, which is when we are going back more consciously towards the source. And so this then has in Neoplatonism several different methods for this. There are particular types of contemplation contemplative practices that are inherent within Neoplatonism. And there's also Theurgy. Theurgy comes about, and we'll talk more about this later, with Iamblichus. And it is a set of practices that are sometimes called spiritual alchemy, or sometimes we could call it higher magic. But it is magic that has to do with reunification and with this kind of idea of spiritual evolution. And so that, again, has a source in Neoplatonism. So Neoplatonism and later esotericism we have the original sources, which is what we're going to be looking at. We're looking at this from within the Hellenistic and Roman pagan world. And then they influence later forms of Western esotericism. Some of the ones that are most important is that it comes through, there's a writer who was called Dionysius the Areopagite, who was considered to be a disciple of the Apostle Paul. And what we know is that these writings that were created, such as the Cloud of Unknowing and so forth, that they were given, they're basically Neoplatonic texts that were given a very thin kind of Christian overlay. And we also know that the author of these is not actually Dionysius the Areopagite. It is, or Dionysius the Areopagite. So we call him now pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite. But these kinds of texts that come through this source are absolutely critical for Christian medieval mysticism, and they use negative theology. Negative theology is a theology that instead of saying, what God is, you say what it's not. It's going through the negative path. It's moving more towards into, it is not this, not this, not this. And so this becomes very important in medieval mysticism and is able to survive and influence later Christian mysticism and theology because it has this kind of Christian veiling on it. And so in the Renaissance, then, in addition to the fact that you have these influences that are coming through some of the Christian tradition, and there's also like Boethius is another who uses a lot of the pagan, the old pagan Neoplatonism, but brings it into a Christian context. Later in the Renaissance, there is, of course, the rediscovery of the ancient texts that are then also revived. And you have this rebirth of Hermetic occultism. And some of the major figures there that you're probably familiar with are Marsilio Ficino. So that he does the first translation of Plotinus, who is one of the main, as I said, he's considered the founder. And then Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Meister Eckhart are all bringing back some of these ancient texts as some examples. There's also pagan Neoplatonism gets combined with both the Kabbalah and with Christianity. So some of the Kabbalistic pieces also have some of this influence. And in the 18th and 19th century, there was a very powerful, well-versed intelligentsia who are called, this is also, you get into influence from, sorry, I'm jumping. There's in the 17th century of the Cambridge Neoplatonists, and they then also are influencing some of this. That in the 18th and 19th century, you have many very well-versed, very well-educated people who are interested in esotericism and a variety of traditions that now have been reading the ancient texts that we're going to be going through, and they are taking them and being influenced by them. And this includes one of them being Theosophy. It is very, very clear when you read Madame Blavatsky's work that she certainly had read quite a few of the original texts. I would say the ones I see most strongly in there are probably Proclus. I do want to go through a general timeline so that you have some sense to kind of put this into. Thales of Miletus is generally considered the very first philosopher, and his dates there 624 to 545 BCE. He is over in the part of Greece that is now Turkey, so he's over in Ionia. And then you have Pythagoras, 581 to 497, and he moved and founded his major school that is also very esoteric in Crotona, and that is in what was now Italy, so in Elia. You have Parmenides, whose dates are uncertain, but he is one of the very first, or probably the first that we know of, clear monists. And he becomes very, very important because at one point he visited Athens when Socrates was a young man, and Socrates sat in a symposium with Parmenides, and this is recounted through Plato's dialogue, Parmenides. And it's very clear that Parmenides and the thought of Parmenides, this kind of unity, this monistic philosophy that also was very mystical, had a strong, powerful influence on Socrates. So Socrates, everything that comes before him, we call them the pre-Socratics. And so Socrates is kind of the turning point in ancient Greek philosophy. And what he's doing is that the pre-Socratics are all kind of looking at the world and trying to figure out how it's working, what's going on there. And what he does is he turns the object of his thought onto thought itself. And so it's this internal move that Socrates makes, where he is now trying to understand what is this capacity that we have to know in these ways that are neither sensory nor sensory correlative. And that's kind of where a lot of this starts to flip with Socrates. His main student, who is incredibly important, is obviously Plato. We don't have any writings by Socrates. Socrates is a character in many of Plato's most important works. And one of the things that we cannot know historically for certain is how much of the Socrates and Plato is actually Platonic thought versus how much of this is actually the thought that Socrates had. We do have some other contemporaneous sources for describing Socrates, so we can kind of tell some, but it is also clear that Plato himself is a brilliant, original thinker and also has a strong mystical bent. Plato's most important student is Aristotle. And Aristotle has a different type of emphasis than Plato. Aristotle is far more interested in how the world works. He is absolutely brilliant, and we'll get into some more about that in a few minutes. But his dates here are 384 to 322. And then we also have in Athens, Zeno of Citium. He is a Stoic. He founds the Stoic school, 334 to 262 BCE. And one of the main people in his school is Chrysippus, 279 to 206. So we have then in Athens, we have the birth of Platonic philosophy. Aristotle goes away, comes back, and has his school in Athens. And at the same time, we also have the Stoics. So Athens is this hotbed of philosophy. Philo-Judaeus is later, but I wanted to mention him. His dates here are 20 to 50 BCE. So he is now, at this point, Alexandria has also become a major philosophical center. And it is through the work of Philo, who is both a Platonist and a Jewish philosopher, that a lot of Platonism starts going into Judaism. So that's just important for us to know. Seneca, 4 BCE to 65 CE, he is a major Roman Stoic. Plutarch, 46 to 119, he's considered a Middle Platonist. He is also the high priest of Delphi, but he's a very powerful thinker as well. Epictetus is another Roman Stoic, 50 to 135. Marcus Aurelius is both a Stoic and the Emperor of Rome, 121 to 180. Then Ammonius Saccas. Ammonius Saccas is a very interesting figure about which we know some, but we have no writings. His dates are 175 to 242 CE, and the main thing that we know is that he brought some influence from India and some influence from Iran or Persia into Greek philosophy. They were already, ever since Alexander the Great, they'd actually been doing a fair amount of crossover on both sides. But he is the teacher of Plotinus. And as I mentioned, Plotinus is considered the very first of the Neoplatonic philosophers. His dates 204 or 5 to 270. Plotinus's main student, Porphyry of Tyre, 234 to 305. And then we have Iamblichus, who we're going to focus on in our third class. And he is both a Platonist, and he also has these very strong kind of priestly drives, and he is the one who brings in Theurgy. 245 to 325. We have the Emperor Julian, known to the Christians as Julian the Apostate, known to the rest of us as the Emperor Julian. He is 331 to 363 CE, and he's the one who tries to rebirth paganism with this very strong Platonic lens. Hypatia, who is a philosopher in Alexandria, 350 to 370 CE. Augustine of Hippo, known to the Christians then as St. Augustine, his days are 354 to 430. He also is a Platonist, and he's bringing it into Christianity. And some of this is coming in through this kind of Neoplatonic lens. Syrianus, we don't know his birth dates, but 437 CE. But the main thing is he is the teacher of Proclus. And Proclus is the last major pagan philosopher, 412 to 485 CE. So what I wanted to do here, I just gave you a whole bunch of dates, but part of the purpose of this, in addition to kind of having some of the names and being able to put them in order a little bit, is there's about 900 years between the birth of Socrates to the death of Proclus. So if we take Socrates as the beginning of the Platonic tradition, this is almost 900 years that we're talking about. So there's a lot of development over this time. It's not a single static point in history. So I do want to quickly go through a little bit more about some of the antecedents so that you have some understanding of where the ground from which Neoplatonism is arising. And as I said, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Stoicism are the major ones. So Socrates, as I mentioned, there is this understanding that when he was young, he had this encounter with Parmenides. But he has a conversion moment that is brought from Delphi, which is he is searching and searching. He keeps apprenticing himself to different philosophers and then getting disappointed in them. And so at one point, one of his friends goes to Delphi and says, "Is there anyone wiser than Socrates?" And the answer that comes back is no, there's not. And Socrates gets this, and he's stunned and trying to make sense out of it. And his basic reaction is, "But I don't know anything." And then his conclusion from that, because it's like, well, the god Apollon does not lie, is, okay, so what that must mean is the fact that I understand that I don't know anything is what is making me more wise. So he goes on what is called theoria. Theoria is actually the word in Greek. It means a sacred journey. And he understands his path as being a theoria. So what he decides he's going to try to do is to try to understand the nature of reality that is behind all things. And he's going to do that by engaging any single person that he can possibly find in dialogue to try to come together and understand what is the nature of reality that is outside of what it is that we perceive through the senses and through other things. So he is searching for truth apart from relativism. He's not interested in opinion. He's very anti-opinion. When people say everyone's entitled to their own opinion, Socrates would be like, no, no one is entitled to their own opinion. It is our job as human beings to do the hard work of trying to find the knowledge of the truth that is beyond opinion. And so he develops then this form of exploration that is called dialectic. And in dialectic, which is this conversation, what they're doing is going through and trying to find what is a universal definition. So what you're trying to do then is find what is it that the good is, as a common example that is in Platonic dialect. And it's not like, what do I think is good? It's what is it that is actually behind all of the things that we think of as good when we really examine them. And he understands dialectic as a form of midwifery. And so this is the term that is used not just in some of the Platonic works, but also then in Proclus, where what they're talking about is the midwifery in which we are birthing the aspect of soul or spirit into direct contact with the that which is divine, essentially, that which is permanent, that which are the ideals. And all of this is driven by a desire to try to understand what is the nature of a good human life. So what is the nature of reality, and what does it mean for living a good human life? That is always the motivation. So Socrates, as I'm sure you all probably know, was martyred by the state of Athens. And his kind of mission passed to his student Plato. And Plato then he's the one who actually founded the academy. He's the one who founded what we would recognize as a school. And he also takes all of this from Socrates. And again, all of the writings that we have are actually Plato. So it's always a little hard to tell what's Socrates, what's Plato. But according to Aristotle, um, the understanding of or discovery or theory of the ideals or the Platonic ideas is actually original to Plato, not to Socrates. And Aristotle was a student, so I kind of take that as a good indicator. So this is the original idealist philosophy. And this is where when we talk about idealist philosophy, what we're talking about, it doesn't just mean like air in the, wouldn't this be great if? It means trying to get at those things that are the transcendental archetypes that are the source of all of the things in the manifest world. And one of the things to understand about the forms, the ideals, the ideas, these are all the archetypes, these are all words that are talking about the same concept here, is that we don't invent them, we are discovering them. They are by their nature universal, they are eternal, they don't change, and they are not sensible. So anytime we're dealing with anything that is sensible that has to do with the senses, that is something that has maybe a root in the ideal, a root in the archetype, but it is not the archetype. Inherent within this, then, inherent within this idealist philosophy is a distinction between what is absolute and relative reality. So absolute reality is the reality of the archetypes themselves. The relative reality is all of the stuff that we deal with in the manifest world that is dependent upon those archetypes for its existence. Another thing that's important in Plato is he does hypothesize the demiurge, because part of the challenge when you get into this idealist philosophy is you've created this, or you have this notion that there are these archetypes that are transcendent, that are universal, that are eternal, that in some way cause all of the manifest reality, but how do you bridge that gap? And so in his dialogue, the Timaeus, he hypothesizes a demiurge, which is a being that brings and creates he's the one who creates the world essentially, and therefore is providing this link. So in Platonic understanding and the theory of knowledge, the Platonic theory of knowledge, real knowledge is not rooted in sense perception, it's not rooted in subjective opinion, and it's not rooted in social opinion. It is rooted in the encounter with these universal archetypal ideals. And this encounter is in a level of self, that there is an aspect of ourselves that is able to have, because we participate in this direct contact with the archetypes. So this also has to do with this notion of Platonic recollection or memory, because if we have an aspect of ourselves that is participating in these universal, timeless, eternal archetypes, then we already know things. We just have to, because we're coming out of that, we're coming out of that place. So it's a matter of climbing back up and then remembering, more so than discovering, or more so than creating, certainly. So it's more like the way in which I experience it myself on those moments in which I'm able to have it. When you hit something that is not sensory, it's not sensory correlative, it is not rooted in time, it's all of these different things, and your experience of it is, I always knew that, but didn't realize it until this moment. That's what the inspiration, at least for me personally, feels like when it's coming through, when I'm actually in those moments able to touch that place. So for those of you who have read Plato's Republic, this will be a refresher for those who don't. This is his analogy of the cave, which is, I think, one of the clearest descriptions of the way in which the forms work. So his kind of description of the analogy of the cave is, let's say that we have a group of people who have been chained their entire lives, looking forward, looking at the wall of a cave. And behind them, where they can't see, it's behind a wall, is fire And then there are people who are taking these kind of puppets back and forth. And what that's doing is casting shadows on the wall. And as they are going through, they're hearing various things, but they can't tell what direction it's coming from. Those people who are down in the cave, looking forward at the wall of the cave, are going to believe that those shadows are the reality of the world, because that's going to be their experience. They've never experienced anything else. But it's not. That's an illusion. It's not correct. So then he imagines what happens if one of them suddenly manages to get free of their chains and they come out and they see that these shadows and everything, that's what they are. They're not real. That's not the real things. And then they manage to make it outside of the cave. They would immediately, the first thing they would experience is being overwhelmed and blinded by the reality, which I think is a very good description if you start looking at mystics. At part of what happens when you have the mystical experience is that it can be overwhelming at first, but then from there they are able to experience what is true reality. And that's when they see, the horse or whatever that's real. So then the other piece of that is if they were to go back and try to tell the people in the cave, like, hey, this isn't real, the people in the cave wouldn't believe that person and could be very upset with them to the point of attacking them. So that's kind of the analogy from the cave. And the idea there is that in the sensible world, in the world of sensory perception, what we are dealing with that we automatically take as real is ultimately not real. So I want to go through the Platonic understanding of the soul. The soul in Platonic theory is immortal. There's also a theory that no one is willingly bad, but because we have bad education, socialization, bad habits can corrupt us. And of course, if you are embedded in a society that does not understand what the true and the real is, because they're, staring at the cave wall, then that's almost inevitable that our education will be problematic. He does have a tripartite understanding of the soul, and those who do the tarot will recognize the metaphor of the chariot. So I'm going to jump forward and then go back because here is our chariot. So the idea is in this tripartite nature of the soul that we have two horses. So all of these are parts of soul. One of the horses is closest to the body, and it's the appetitive function. It's the one that desires, and it's also where some of the power comes from. And then you have the horse that is spirited, and it's kind of like the heart. And we can think of it in a certain way of being kind of like the enemies, the heart emotions, the passionate. So you have these two are the horses. And then there is the charioteer, which is another part of soul. And that is the part that is responsible for getting them to operate in balance and going where the charioteer is directing. And that is the reason. So part of what's kind of interesting about this is that, of course, the horses are the ones in so many ways with like the power for motion, and you absolutely need them. You absolutely need them. There's nothing bad about any parts of the soul, but they do require the charioteer in order to be functional. And one of the things that I find very powerful about this is which is there in the ancient Greek also, and anyone who is from that culture would recognize it in this symbology, is about the turning point. So the turning point is like in a horse race, or chariot race, like in the Olympics or whatever. When you come to the turning point, the way it would be is you would run down and then you would have to turn a very sharp turn around. Usually it was like a hero's grave, because that's kind of this is probably the old funeral games. But what it's requiring is this very dynamic movement by the charioteer, who is reason, about how to let one of the horses out so it pivots while bringing the other horse in very tightly. So this very dynamic kind of movement between the various aspects of self in order to get everything to cooperate to make this turn. And of course, the turning point has a lot of important meanings for us as well in terms of spiritually, the turning point in various kinds of events. The metaphor of that, though, has to do with how well the reason is able to work with the other aspects of self to do that kind of maneuver. So the ethics in Platonic philosophy are what we call eudaimonic, which means it has to do with, it's often translated as happiness, but it really has to do with the search for the good. What does it mean to live as a good spirit? So that's some of the background with Plato. A couple of other aspects of Platonic philosophy. He's got a lot on political philosophy and a lot on aesthetics. So Aristotle's verse in memory of Plato, because sometimes they're portrayed almost as being enemies, which is not the case. Aristotle was his main student and remained very devoted to him, although he was critical of certain aspects, largely as a corrective, I think. So I wanted to share Aristotle's verse in memory of Plato upon Plato's death. Of that unique man whose name is not to come from the lips of the wicked, theirs is not the right to praise him. Him who first revealed clearly by word and by deed that he who is virtuous is happy. Alas, not one of us can equal him. So Aristotle was Plato's main student. He was the teacher of Alexander the Great. And then when Alexander went on his campaigns, he helped Aristotle go back to Athens and founded then the Lyceum there. Aristotle's followers, if you ever run into this, are sometimes called the Peripatetics. Those are just followers of the Aristotelian schools because they liked to have their discussions while moving. So they like to be walking and having their conversations. He was an absolutely extraordinary polymath. I have a tremendous amount of respect for both Plato and for Aristotle. Aristotle is brilliant in terms of, he's not, well, no, that's not true. He actually did have a reputation as also being artistic. Plato is very artistically inclined. Aristotle actually did have that reputation, but we didn't have his more artistic dialogues, did not survive. But he's the founder of logic, and you can tell. I mean, if you ever read his works, which I encourage you to do, they're just astounding in their precision. But Aristotle's emphasis is very different than Plato. Plato was very much about finding the transcendent, touching the transcendent. And Aristotle is far more interested in the immanent than in the transcendent. And one of the things that is important to remember when we're comparing these two is that we don't have comparable sources. For Plato, we only have his dialogues that were meant for public consumption. We do not have his lectures that were meant for his more senior audience. And in Aristotle, it's the opposite. We only have the lectures meant for his senior students. We do not have any of his dialogues that were meant for the general populace. So many of Aristotle's texts were included in the Neoplatonic curriculum because by the time we get to Plotinus, we do have like a school that has a curriculum. And there are then, after Plotinus, who is in Rome, you have a Syrian school, Athenian school, Alexandrian school, but they definitely have like a curriculum. And so many of his texts were included, including a number of them on logic, which, like I said, he is the founder of logic, ethics, physics, and theology or metaphysics. He did have a strong disagreement with Plato about the nature of the forms. So as I said, in Platonic theory, the intelligible world of ideas is separated from the sensible world, so the world of the senses. And the separation of essential and material causes is really kind of a challenge in many ways because you can't really explain other than, oh, well, there's the demiurge. Like, how does this link together? So Aristotle opposes the separation and doesn't accept the demiurge as formulated. He just doesn't think that that is sufficient to be the cause for the sensible world. Basically, he thinks it's logically sloppy. And he also argues that the doctrine of the forms doesn't help us understand the manifest world because there's this separation, and Aristotle's main interest is trying to understand the manifest world. However, Aristotle does believe that the universal is real, not subjective, and that it is knowable. So in Stoicism, which is the third of these major traditions that Neoplatonism is going to bring together, nature itself, it's sometimes called nature worshiping, but not in the way in which we would tend to think of it in terms of being out in the woods kind of thing. But there's an understanding of universal nature as being an organism. So you can actually have something that is getting closer to like the Gaia hypothesis there. Nature is active, it is rational, and it pervades everything, including human souls, that human souls are essentially part of nature. It is a more materialist philosophy. This is understood as maybe not always being physical materialism, but subtle materialism. Everything is material and has material cause. Nature creates matter and then reabsorbs it in cyclical patterns. So this is actually very similar in to the Theosophical understanding of Pralaya and Manvantara, where in Pralaya, everything is like drawn in so that it is back into this unitive thing that is neither void nor plenum, and then it like goes out into the Manvantara, into the manifested reality, and then it gets drawn back in into, usually we think of that as being the void, and then back out. So this periods of activity and inactivity like breath. Nature, and therefore the world, because nature is divine, are essentially good. And providence has to do with what they call the divine plan. So we can see some similarities there with some of the later esotericism as well. So those are the three major traditions. I'm going to go a little bit more into some of the developments in the Platonic, since, like I said, Neoplatonism is Platonic, but it's bringing in and synthesizing these others. You do have Plutarch, who I mentioned is a Middle Platonist, a very important Middle Platonist. He wrote the Lives, which is a very interesting set of texts if you're interested in ethics and history. He's a very prolific author, and as I mentioned, he was also the high priest of Apollo at Delphi. He's a Platonist, and so he's very interested in these very abstract transcendent ideas, but he's also interested in religious ecstasy and in immediate experiential contact with the transcendent, including prophecy. He had experienced a whole lot of it because, like I said, for decades, he was the high priest at Delphi. So he had all of this very direct, very intimate understanding about divine contact and about things like prophecy and about things like religious ecstasy. He says that the gods, they have no responsibility for evil. That is not theirs. He did also have this understanding of intermediary beings that are below God, that maybe sometimes when something's happening, it may not be the high god, Apollo in particular, but it might be a being in his retinue. So you start to see that in Plutarch. He also had the strong understanding that all religions and all cultures are worshiping the same God under different names. And I will just mention here that something like, which I've always been very drawn to, the Theosophical motto of there is no religion higher than truth, is getting at something where all of the cultures have their own take on it, but maybe they're talking about the same thing. And of course, that's rooted in it becomes perennial philosophy, what we now call perennial philosophy. So in the rise of Neoplatonism, you have a particular cultural context of strong cosmopolitanism. So this is after the Hellenistic mishmash, which is like this incredible cultural mashup. And that's from Alexander the Great, where you have all of these different cultures that come together and then they are syncretizing together. And there's this just incredible, really it's a cultural mashup, so that they are trying to understand this notion that we are citizens of the cosmos, not citizens of our individual polis. And that was part of Alexander the Great's very explicit purpose in trying to do what he did. It's that he was trying to create the cosmopolis, and this idea that you would take the best of all cultures and then you would blend them together into this cosmopolitan culture. So there's also a lot of religious synthesis. So, they're recognizing the gods in different places under different names, but being the same god. So you have a lot of that. You have a lot of kind of like, oh, well, if Hermes is the same as Tahuti in Egypt, or Thoth, however you want to spell it and say it, there's different ways. If those are really the same being, then we can create something that is drawing on both Greek and Egyptian traditions to do that. So there's a lot of that going on. Also, there's an extreme importance of the mystery religions. Those were always important in the Hellenic world. They spread to the Hellenistic world, and then they became very universal during this period. There are a lot of magical texts that are coming that have to do with this religious synthesis and working very directly with the gods. A lot of these now are in the PGM and so forth. So a lot of them are in Alexandria, but they are also other places. And then you also have the rise of early Christianity, and you have the rise of Gnosticism. This is before Christianity has really consolidated into what we would currently recognize as the historical church in the same way. So there's just a lot going on. So let me go through some of the major thought here. But like I said, we'll also cover this in more depth with the various thinkers. So first of all, monism. Monism, like I said, is a key philosophical concept that we have in Neoplatonism. There is this idea that there is a source that is the one, and that is the source of all things. And it is not really the one. It is that which is neither being nor non-being. It is transcendent. It has no attributes. And it is beyond subject and object differentiation, and therefore has no self-knowledge. And it's very important in Neoplatonism that they say the one has no self-knowledge, because the moment you have self-knowledge, you have split into a knower and a known, and that is actually what kicks off emanation. So the one, the source, the all, has no self-knowledge. It is outside of time. It is outside of space. It is transcendent of all these things. So as I said, then the way in which Neoplatonism tries to deal with this problem of how do you get from like the forms to the manifest world is through emanation. So you have the notion of the one that is neither being nor non-being. And as I said, there is no subject-object differentiation. And it does not have self-knowledge. Something causes an aspect to then have the one have some self, it's not the one having self-knowledge, but there is something that causes contemplation of itself. So if you can think of it that way, this is probably the easiest way to think of it is in our meditation, where you contemplate yourself and then you're aware that there is a known and there is a knower. And so what is happening then in that moment in which there is some self-knowledge, that aspect that is now looking at the one, that is exploring and contemplating it, that then is the nous. That is what is sometimes called the mind of God. That is what causes the beginning of the emanation forth. So you have this notion of the nous that is contemplating the one, and in so doing, as it is contemplating, it is having a thought. And that thought then is the next level. That's the world soul. So all of these is kind of, as I mentioned, is ontology that is also cosmology, and it's also all consciousness. So it is through this act of contemplation, if you want to use that as an understanding, that you are having this creation that is going down. And so from the world soul, then looking at the nous, and the nous is where the archetypes, the ideals, the forms are. As it is doing that, then that is what is creating, as it is looking at the nous and contemplating the ideals, that is what is then creating the world of the manifold changeable things. And then eventually kind of the potency runs out. So you have almost like this hall of mirrors, reflection, 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 as you're kind of like contemplating up, and it runs out in inert matter. Now, inert matter is not physical stuff. It's not this. It's more like in the Platonic system or in the Neoplatonic system, it's more like copier toner. It's just the stuff that when it then is combined with a form is what gives this. But everything that we look at and it's like, oh, it's the physical world, that's not matter. Anything we look at in the physical world is a combination of matter with form brought together by nature. And we'll go through more of that later. So the world soul is very similar to the Stoic conceptions of nature then. It is both eminent and transcendent. And in the Platonic system, it is not fully materialist, because it does also have this spiritual transcendent nature that is connected and participating in the nous, the mind of God. As I mentioned, there is no such thing as absolute evil in this kind of system. Nature is inherently good. However, there is such a thing as distortion. And in no small measure, that can happen because of copy degradation, which I think this is like the analogy I would use now is, as I mentioned, you're coming down. So the level below is contemplating what's up and is having a thought about it, and that is creating the next level. And this happens on down the scales. So imagine for a moment, as you're doing this contemplation, most of us have had experience with copiers. So you take a piece of paper that has something on it and you make a copy, and then you make a copy of the copy, and then you make a copy of that copy. And after a while, you will begin to have some degradation. And you can see this, you could use your own digital analogies as well. So basically, that is part of when corruption creeps in, which is not absolute evil. It's a distortion. It's a distortion that can be either an accretion or it can be kind of a lack. But the other thing that happens in what we call evil is that sometimes we are identifying as humans with the lower causal levels as opposed to recognizing the aspects of ourself that are some of the higher, more spiritual aspects. And that also we're not inherently active and fit in our higher levels. So as all of these things are coming down, we are also participating all the way down from, mind of God on down, from the more transcendent to the more and more specific. Our reason, which is neither sensory nor sensory correlative, is linked into some of those higher aspects of being. But if we don't use it, we're not clear in it. That's part of why philosophy is considered very important and like a mystery, because it's getting us to participate, to be active in those areas so that we are able to consciously participate in these higher levels. We always do participate. We're often not aware of them. The awareness doesn't make its way all down. So again, that's part of the cause of evil, is that we are relative evil, is that we're not active and fit in those higher levels. And therefore, when we are acting, sometimes the impulses from the highest aspects of self can't get expressed all the way through in a clear fashion. So hierarchy is another piece that I had mentioned, divine hierarchy. Ontology is cosmology, this idea, again, that all of this, as we have this descent into the mantles of density, these are all beings. This is all, and we are participating. So these are great beings in which we are living and moving, having our being, and, and therefore also consciousness. And as they're coming down, they're intermediary beings, so that, maybe you have something that is more directly what we might call a god, and then you might have something that's on down. And we'll see this playing out in what's called the Syrii, the angels, daimon, which gets translated as demon, but it's a spirit that is not as high as some of the others, but is higher than us. And then as it comes down all the way down into humans and so forth. So as I said, there's a place for many, many spirit beings in these chains that we'll talk more about when we get to Iamblichus and Proclus in particular. And through this type of understanding of hierarchy that is coming out of this emanatory scheme and various chains, you are able to accommodate various understandings of the traditional gods get incorporated into this philosophy. As I mentioned, it is Platonism, it is Aristotelianism, and it is Stoicism mixed with a very heavy dose of mysticism. Plotinus, who is considered the founder of Neoplatonism, is also recognized as one of the world's great mystics. And his book, which we will talk about next time, is considered one of the great pieces of writing from a mystic. So there is this notion then, if everything is coming from the one, and there's also this possibility of reascent, that it is possible for us to achieve union with the one. And that is what mysticism ultimately is. And it is always described as ineffable, which means unspeakable. And I always find it interesting, having read an awful lot of books and so forth by mystics who always say it's ineffable and then go on to write about it for hundreds of pages. What they're actually talking about there is a logical ineffability. It's an experience, it's outside of time, it's outside of space. It has no attributes and it has no subject-object differentiation. And that is the foundation of language. I mean, you have to have a subject, you have to have an object. It is embedded in time, it's embedded in space, and it has attributes. So basically what we can say is it is ineffable, and everything I say that tries to indicate that is not the true thing. So I think it is a logical ineffability. So as I mentioned, outside of time and space, in the mystical experience, there are no attributes, there's no sense of subject and object differentiation. It is clearly attested to and driving this philosophy. And like I said, it is absolutely clear in Plotinus especially. And in Plotinus especially, but also in some of the others, but Plotinus is especially about this, there are methods of attaining mystical union that are in the text. Part of what they are trying to do is to give you some pathways, give you some maps, so that you can get to this experience of union with the one, the source of all, that is all. So within Neoplatonism, there are a number of practices that are important. First of all, there is study as practice. Certainly by the end of Neoplatonism, they are treating Platonic texts, the Platonic dialogues, as though they are sacred text. And they are getting something sacred out of them. They are going into this study with the intention of being fundamentally transformed through the process of study. And a huge part of what's going on in these esoteric schools that are the Neoplatonic academies is that you are studying the texts, especially of Plato. You'll be studying like Aristotle and so forth, this like preliminary to get your mind in shape so that you're able to be transformed by some of the considered higher Platonic texts. But you are studying them with a master, with a teacher. That's what's happening, is that you are spending your time studying the Platonic texts and being guided through that study as a mystical process with someone who has done this before. There are also contemplative practices within this that are embedded within those texts. And we'll go through some of that, very specific kinds of meditative contemplative practices. And then there's Theurgy, which, like I said, really comes into play with Iamblichus and is also there in Proclus. And Theurgy is considered the complement, sometimes the opposition to theology. Theology is the holy words, and this is, or the God words, and this Theurgy is the God practice, is what that means. So there are various kinds of practices, magical practices that are put into play that are intended to create this kind of spiritual evolution. So I do want to quickly go through again some of the major figures in Neoplatonism in a little bit more depth. I gave you the overall kind of, here's the timeline of all of these. Ammonius Saccas, he was rooted in Alexandria, and as I mentioned, he was the teacher of Plotinus. And we also know that Plotinus learned some things about Persian and Indian philosophy from him. Now, as I said, from the time of Alexander the Great, there is a lot of sharing back and forth between Indian and Hellenic and Roman philosophy. That's something that was happening, and then it's separated again later. Which actually, interestingly, philosophy arises at the same time independently and almost exactly at the same time in India and Greece. And then, like I said, it comes together during Alexander's conquests, and then when the various cultures are being melded together, and also just with the trade and everything that continues on from them. So part of the deal with Ammonius Saccas is that sometimes we are a little unclear, much like we're unclear with Socrates and Plato, about how much of Plato's thought and work is really Socrates and how much is original to Plato. We are not clear about that either with Plotinus and Ammonius Saccas, but we don't have any writings by Ammonius Saccas. So, Plotinus clearly has a debt to him, but we don't really know how much. There's also the Christian Origen is also a student of Ammonius Saccas. So there's influence in that direction too. Plotinus will be our study next week when we get together. So we will be going through Plotinus, and his work is the Enneads. He only has the one work, but like I said, it is considered not only just important for philosophical reasons, but I actually first encountered it when I was working on a PhD in religion at UC Santa Barbara, and I was working on comparative mysticism. And that was, I had to choose a mystic that I was going to really focus in on, and so it was Plotinus. So that was my first introduction to Plotinus all those years ago. Very, very important from the perspective of mysticism. His main student was Porphery of Tyre. And Porphery is actually his editor and his biographer as well. And Porphyry also was an important philosopher in his own right. He incorporated Aristotle's logic into Neoplatonism. He did a much clearer job of doing that. That's where you really get that strong emphasis. He had a very strong emphasis on the ideas of spiritual purification. And Porphyry saw the traditional gods as allegories. So he read all of them as allegories. That is very different than Iamblichus or Proclus. I want to be clear about that. So that is a place where there was some division within the Neoplatonic understanding. He also wrote a tractate in which every copy was burned by Theodosius, the Pope, that was against the Christians, which was apparently incredibly powerful and incredibly cutting. One of the things about Porphyry is that he also had a very, very strong logical mind and was very good at asking questions and asking very pointed questions, which becomes important later with Iamblichus as well, because Iamblichus was both a student of Porphyry and then was also his rival. So there was a lot of tension between Porphyry and Iamblichus. They weren't very far apart in age either, but Iamblichus left Porphyry and went back to Syria, where he was from, and founded another Neoplatonic esoteric school there, which was very influential. Hypatia, many of you will know, is also an important Neoplatonist. She was in the Alexandrian school, and she rejected the theurgy of both of Iamblichus and returned more towards the philosophy of Plotinus. Most of her students were Christians, and one of the things, though, that we know the most about her is that she was martyred very violently by a mob of Christian extremists, even though most of her students were Christian. We don't have a lot of her extant texts, but most of the ones that we do have are commentaries, and she was especially known for her mathematical commentaries and some of what we would now call natural science. Syrianus is in charge of the Athenian school, and he was the teacher of Proclus. Again, much like what we've had with Ammonius and Plotinus, Socrates and Plato, we are a little unclear about how much of the work of Proclus is his original thought and how much is really from the thought of Syrianus, because we don't have a lot of the text from Syrianus surviving. So there are a lot of places where Proclus will say, as our father, which he's meaning Syrianus, or attributing our beloved teacher or whatever. So he does attribute a lot to Syrianus, and we think that probably a lot of the more original things in Proclus are probably not original to him, but they're original to Syrianus. But Proclus is a great systematizer. Some of the very first, what we would call systematic theology, is written by Proclus. And we are going to go through that in class 4. So again, some of the legacy of Neoplatonism, we have this legacy within the Western esoteric traditions. As we see the modern esoteric traditions, they after the Renaissance on, where they have recovered the pagan texts and are clearly reading them and clearly being influenced by them. And then there's also the influence that comes in from some of the medieval mystical practices and various kinds of medieval alchemical practices. And those have come through the pagan tradition earlier than that in many ways, but under these guises, such as through Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, and Boethius. Judaism and Neoplatonists, we see the medieval Jewish Kabbalists also have been influenced. And then, although I can't trace this for absolute certain, we know that Platonism strongly begins to influence some of Jewish philosophy with Philo, and I believe there's still, I can't trace it precisely, but I think there's still some Neoplatonic influence even later into Judaism. And of course, Jews were often embedded within all of the major polises of the ancient world, all the major cities. And so there is this kind of moving back and forth and dialogue throughout the entire ancient world. The Jews were not separated at that time in the same way. I mean, they had their own practices and they had their own places within the cities, but they also were embedded within these larger contexts all over. In Islam, Avicenna, Ibn al-Arabi, al-Kindi, al-Farabi, basically they are very strongly influenced by Neoplatonism. They're also very strongly influenced by Aristotle, who is the sage. But in the Muslim understanding of Neoplatonism, the one basically becomes Allah. And again, we have to give tremendous gratitude to the Muslim scholars, because many of these texts were preserved, and we have them because they came through and were continued to be studied within the Muslim areas. And then, as I had mentioned, there's the Cambridge Neoplatonists, and they're Christian. They're 17th century, rooted in England, and that is where they really begin working with this idea of the perennial philosophy. The philosophy that is the truth that shows up in different cultures across time, looking maybe slightly different, but always heading back into the same transcendent truth. And that, of course, is very important for Theosophy and other esoteric traditions as well, this notion of the perennial philosophy.